Stoic ethics is a kind of virtue ethics. So, as we saw with Aristotle and Mencius, there is a great emphasis placed upon cultivating oneself throughout one's life and recognizing your own and others' human nature. While we do not read any specific and focused overarching argument in Marcus's Meditations, we can still find in his words some tenets of Stoic philosophy and Stoic virtue ethics in particular. These tenets of Stoic philosophy eventually got codified by scholars into the three disciplines. We will take them each on their own in the next few slides, but as an introduction, I'll say a few words on each of them here. First, the discipline of perception is to see the world as it is, and to learn to note the difference between what happens and one's evaluation of what happened. Second, the discipline of action is to accept what is in your control and to cooperate with other people. And third, the discipline of will is to accept what is outside of your control and to accept that nothing can harm you but you. The discipline of perception is the practice of facing that the world is exactly as it should be. The discipline of perception tells us to see the world as it is, and in Hay's words, it, quote, requires that we maintain absolute objectivity of thought, that we see things dispassionately for what they are, end quote. This true sight requires that we note the difference between what happens and our evaluation of it. So we must be vigilant of inappropriate value judgments, of designating things as good or evil when in fact they are neither good nor evil. Let's take an example from our translator Hayes. Imagine if your house burns down. Hayes says, quote, my perception that my house has burned down and that I have thereby suffered a terrible tragedy includes not only an impression, but also an interpretation imposed upon that initial impression. It is by no means the only possible interpretation, and I am not obliged to accept it. I may be a good deal better off if I decline to do so, end quote. The fact is, it happened. Something flammable caught flame, and the house is no longer standing. Stoicism argues that the suffering comes from the interpretation of the event as a tragedy. On this view, interpretations or evaluations of things is what causes the psychological discomfort. As Hayes says, quote, it is, in other words, not objects and events, but the interpretation we place upon them that are the problem, end quote. It is our interpretation of events and objects as bad or evil that leads us to suffer from them. In Book 1, Entry 8, we see Marcus speak to this idea. He writes, quote, to be the same in all circumstances, intense pain, the loss of a child, chronic illness, end quote. Why? Why to be the same in all circumstances? Because my character is not changed by these events unless I let it be. The idea is to own who you are. Consistency of character combined with control of one's thoughts and judgments is the route to fulfilling your potential and obtaining this state of always being you. The discipline of action is the practice of loving others. As Hayes says, it, quote, relates to our relationship with other people, end quote, and that all human beings possess not only a share of the logos, but also the ability to use it. We are participants in the logos, end quote. A basic tenet of Stoicism is that we need to live according to the logos. Doing so requires not merely passive acquiescence in what happens, but active cooperation with the world and with other human beings. We are made, Marcus tells us, not for ourselves, but for others, and our nature is fundamentally unselfish, end quote. So part of the logos is that we're meant to work with others and to act for what's best for the common good. Two excerpts from the text nicely illustrate the discipline of action. In Book 1, Entry 9, Marcus says, quote, to be free of passion but full of love, end quote. So the Stoics understand love not as an emotion simply, but as a relation. To love others is to relate to them as equals in nature, and to relate to them as part of the human project of the logos. It's to recognize that no one is more important to the universe than anyone else. In book 2, entry 1, Marcus writes, quote, "We are born to work together, like feet, hands, and eyes," end quote. Again, Marcus is describing the natural state of human beings, that we're better when we work together, while also recognizing our distinctness. This line and way of thinking, that human beings are each a part of a larger body of humanity, is both beautiful and dangerous. It is easy to imagine a benevolent emperor like Marcus Aurelius seeing this analogy as a justification for understanding himself as the head or the eyes, and thus his political authority is in line with the logos. How convenient it is to think humans are equal in the sense that we need feet, hands, and heads, when Stoicism asks you to accept your fate as a head. Imagine what it is like to be told by a politically powerful Stoic to accept your place in the universe as the feet of our collective human body, a fate of simultaneously being supportive of the whole body, indicating great strength, and of being walked all over, indicating pain, but a pain that will be made invisible or will be ignored with utterances like just your lot in life or just the way it is. Many of you probably know what I'm talking about and are, in fact, suspicious of a philosophy that tells people to accept their lot in life. It is essential when we read philosophy, and anything, that we keep a critical eye out for when a writer or thinker begins to slip into justifications for oppression. Nonetheless, I think there's tremendous value in the discipline of action, to recognize the humanity in ourselves and others, the demand to relate to others, no matter their social class, as co-participants in life, is a pillar of strong moral thinking. The discipline of will is the practice of humility. Hayes offers a good point of contrast here. He says, quote, "The discipline of will is, in a sense, the counterpart to the second, the discipline of action. The latter governs our approach to the things in our control, those that we do. The discipline of will governs our attitude to things that are not within our control, those that we have done to us, by others, or by nature." End quote. The discipline of will concerns ourselves and our reactions. With regard to myself, only I can harm my soul. Only I can harm me. More to Hay's point, the discipline of will concerns what is not in our control. To repeat his words, the discipline of will governs our attitude to things that are not within our control, those that have been done to us, by others, or by nature. So it is the practice of being humble with regard to what you can control. Hayes expands on the meaning of this discipline nicely. Quote, "If we act wrongful, then we have done serious harm to ourselves, though not, it should be emphasized, to others or to the logos. By contrast, things outside of our control have no ability to harm us. Acts of wrongdoing by a human agent, torture, theft, or other crimes, harm the agent, not the victim. Acts of nature, such as fire, illness, or death, can harm us only if we choose to see them as harmful." Unquote. This might sound bananas, but remember discipline 1. The discipline of perception tells us to see things as they are. And so we can see that in Stoicism, the will must conform to perception in order to work on accepting what we can control, which is relatively little, and to accept what can harm us, which is again relatively little. We have to practice facing the world, facing the fact that the world is exactly as it is and as it should be. Stoics believe that you are the only one in a position to harm yourself because of the fact that the majority of what is happening is outside of your control. And when you allow stuff that is outside of your control to affect you negatively in some way, what is actually happening is that you've interpreted it as something that could be different, as something that could or should be other than it is, as something that you could have prevented, as something that had you done differently, it wouldn't have hurt as much or done as much damage. And the Stoic way of thinking is just trying to sort of recenter your understanding of what you're responsible for. And only that which you are responsible for can actually harm you. Because what really is you is not just sort of your physical body or the specific thoughts in your head. What is really you is your soul, your character, this sort of steady ego that comes to mind when you think of yourself. And that can only be affected by what you choose to affect it. Two excerpts from the text nicely illustrate the discipline of will. In Book 1, Entry 10, Marcus writes, quote, not to be constantly correcting people, and in particular, not to jump on them whenever they make an error of usage or grammatical mistake or mispronounce something. To insert the right expression unobtrusively. This first entry I've highlighted is basically saying don't be petty. For the Stoics, don't be petty because your actions aren't really harming others, they mostly harm yourself. So just chill out and let it be. People make mistakes and people act or speak from ignorance, but you don't have to make correcting them your thing. Rather, pay attention to what's really at stake. Someone may make a mistake in their effort to discuss something with you. Don't make that mistake the topic of your discussion. And in Book 2, Entry 16, your soul is harmed, quote, when it turns its back on another person or sets out to do it harm, as the souls of the angry do, end quote. So the second entry is really getting at the point of Stoic ethics, that your actions don't harm others. Your actions harm yourself, if they are harmful actions. And the greatest harm you can do in Stoic ethics is to act contrary to nature. And nature dictates that we relate to each other as equals, even those who have not adopted the Stoic way of life.